You know, when we're taught the history of human thought, specifically like the history of Western philosophy and the scientific method, there's usually this very specific, almost architectural metaphor that gets used to describe the Islamic world's contribution.
Oh, right, the bridge metaphor.
Exactly, the bridge.
Yeah.
We're basically taught to think of it as this very narrow, temporary, purely utilitarian bridge. The story goes that the ancient Greeks built this massive, shining fortress of logic and reason.
Right.
And when the Roman Empire fell and the Dark Ages set in, those precious Greek texts had to be carried across this dark, murky river of historical time. And the people who carried them were Muslim scholars.
Yeah, that's the standard textbook version.
Right. They translated Aristotle and Plato into Arabic, marched them across this historical bridge, handed them off to the West during the Renaissance, and then the bridge just collapsed. In this telling, Islamic philosophy dies out abruptly in the 12th century with the philosopher Averroes, and the East just goes entirely dark, sinking into theological dogmatism.
I mean, it's the classic transmission narrative, and it is incredibly pervasive. It completely reduces an entire civilization's intellectual output to, well, a glorified courier service.
Courier service, yeah.
As if their only purpose in the grand scheme of human history was to keep the seat warm for the European Enlightenment. It's a very neat, linear timeline, and it is profoundly, fundamentally incorrect.
That bridge narrative completely falls apart the moment you actually look at the historical record. The listener who sent us our research for today's deep dive provided us with Seyyed Hossein Nasr's extensive, exhaustive mapping of this era, and what it reveals isn't a bridge at all.
Not even close.
It is a vast, thriving, multi-dimensional continent of thought. A living intellectual tradition that spans over 1,200 years and actually flourished in the East for centuries after its supposed death in the West.
Which is just wild to think about, given how it's taught.
It really is.
Yeah.
So our mission today for you, the listener, is to explore a universe where brilliant minds didn't just copy the Greeks, but created entirely new systems of thought. We're going to look at how they balanced rigorous mathematical logic with profound spiritual illumination, all within a world completely dominated by the reality of divine revelation.
Before we really begin unpacking the mechanics of these philosophies, though, it is important to lay down a brief disclaimer. The material we're diving into today deals heavily with theology, religious doctrine, and the mechanics of faith in the Islamic world.
Definitely.
Our goal here is purely objective historical exploration. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing any specific religious doctrines, whether from the East or the West. What we are doing is opening the hood to examine the brilliant, intricate, intellectual machinery built by these historical thinkers. We want to understand the architecture of their arguments, how they defined reality, and how they solved massive logical problems.
Right. And to understand those logical problems, we really have to understand the environment these thinkers were operating in. This tradition operates in what's often called the land of prophecy.
That's a great way to put it.
Think about modern secular philosophy. It usually starts by assuming nothing, right? It's Cartesian. You doubt everything until you find a bedrock of certainty. But this tradition operates in a universe where revelation, the literal word of God given to a prophet, is the ultimate undeniable reality.
Yes, that is the starting point. It's not up for debate.
Exactly. So, okay, let's unpack this for a second. The foundation is the absolute oneness of God, and the skyline is the truth of the Quranic revelation. Doing philosophy here is like building a house. The philosopher's job isn't to invent the ground they stand on or to pretend the sky doesn't exist. Their job is to engineer the most beautiful, structurally sound, perfectly logical building that connects that specific ground to that specific sky. It's what we call prophetic philosophy.
That is the crucial distinction. Because if you try to read these thinkers as if they were post-Enlightenment secular rationalists who were, secretly trying to undermine religion, you will completely misunderstand their project.
Oh, absolutely.
In this intellectual universe, there are basically three distinct dimensions constantly interacting and competing. First, there is falsafa, which is philosophy in the Greek sense, but eventually it morphs into something closer to theosophy, like a divine, synthesized wisdom.
Okay, so that's the Greek influence stuff.
Exactly. Second, there is kalum, which is scholastic theology. The practitioners of kalum, the mutakallimun, are primarily concerned with using rational arguments to defend the tenets of the faith against doubt and heresy. They're the defenders of orthodoxy, essentially.
And the third one?
The third is gnosis, or Sufism, which in Arabic is marifa, or irfan. This is illuminative, liberating knowledge. It's the idea that ultimate truth is gained not just through the brain's logic, but through the ascetic purification of the heart.
What really fascinates me here is how these early Muslim thinkers viewed the Greek building materials they inherited, you know? Because Western history tends to view the rediscovery of Greek philosophy as this purely secularizing force, right? Like a return to pagan rationalism.
Right, that's the standard framing.
But the early Islamic philosophers didn't see it that way at all. They actually associated Hermes, the legendary ancient sage of Greco-Egyptian antiquity, with the Islamic prophet Idris. So they actually identified the origin of the Greek philosophical tradition with early divine revelation.
Yeah, that's a brilliant insight. They believed that human reason, at its absolute highest peak, is essentially divine. So when they were translating Plato or Aristotle, they didn't feel they were importing foreign pagan ideas that threatened their monotheism.
It wasn't an invasion of foreign thought.
Not at all. They believed they were recovering ancient divine wisdom that had somehow been scattered over time, and their goal was to master it, refine it, and integrate it into their own independent universe of discourse. It was a relentless search for truth. They basically operated on the principle that one should never be ashamed to acknowledge truth from whatever source it comes, because all truth ultimately emanates from the same divine source.
Which brings us to the first great architects who started building this structure, the Peripatetics. In Arabic, they're known as the Mashoa school.
Which translates roughly to those who walk about.
Yeah, exactly. Which was the label for Aristotle's followers in ancient Greece. But this wasn't just a carbon copy of Aristotle. It was this massive, highly original synthesis of Aristotelian logic, Neoplatonic ideas about how the universe emanates from the one, and core Islamic tenets. And this whole project really kicks off in Baghdad in the 9th century with a thinker named Al-Kindi.
Al-Kindi is monumental. He is often called the philosopher of the Arabs, and his most vital contribution was essentially linguistic engineering.
Linguistic engineering, how so?
Well, before Al-Kindi, Arabic was a language of breathtaking poetry and divine revelation, sure. But it was not a language of technical metaphysical philosophy. How do you debate ontology or epistemology if you don't even have the words for those concepts?
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that.
Right. So Al-Kindi had to forge the technical terminology required to express complex Greek metaphysical concepts in Arabic. He wrote over 200 treatises grappling with the harmonization of faith and reason.
But his immediate students were mostly mathematicians and scientists, right? His real philosophical successor didn't appear until a generation later, all the way over in Central Asia. That is Al-Farabi.
Yes, known as the second teacher, the first being Aristotle, of course.
Right. Al-Farabi is this incredible polymath. He was a practicing Sufi mystic, a master logician, and, weirdly enough, one of the greatest theoreticians of music in Islamic history. But his most significant contribution was creating a completely original system of Islamic political philosophy.
His work there is just astounding.
He basically took Plato's idea of the philosopher king from the Republic and synthesized it with the Islamic concept of the prophet in his masterpiece, the Book of the Opinions of the Citizens of the Virtuous City.
The mechanics of Al-Farabi's virtuous city are brilliant because he builds the city to mirror the exact structure of the cosmos. In his cosmology, everything emanates in a strict hierarchy from the first cause, which is God.
Like a trickle-down effect.
Exactly. The first cause generates the intellects, which generate the heavenly spheres, moving all the way down to the active intellect that governs the earthly realm. Al-Farabi argues that a human society must replicate this divine hierarchy to be virtuous.
So the ruler can't just be some guy who won an election.
No, the ruler of the city cannot just be a clever politician. The ruler must be someone whose own intellect has been perfected to the point that it can actually receive direct emanation from the active intellect. In Plato's terms, this is the philosopher king, but in Islamic terms, it is the prophet, or the divinely guided imam.
So the city only functions if the person at the very top is literally plugged into the divine intelligence, and then that wisdom cascades down through the various ranks of citizens, just like planetary spheres receiving light.
Precisely. If a city lacks that specific type of leader, or if the citizens aim only for wealth or pleasure rather than ultimate truth, it becomes an ignorant city or a corrupt city. Al-Farabi is laying down a rigorous, logically deduced argument for why revelation and philosophy must be united in the perfect human being.
It's an elegant system, for sure. But the absolute pinnacle of this early peripatetic school The thinker who basically writes the operating system for all medieval philosophy, both East and West, is Ibn Sina.
Known to Europe as Avicenna.
Yes, Avicenna. We are in the late 10th and early 11th centuries now. He was a Persian polymath, arguably the greatest physician of the Middle Ages, and he created a philosophical synthesis that dominated intellectual thought for centuries. His most revolutionary contribution was in ontology, the study of being.
Yes, his ontology changes everything.
Because before him, if you read Aristotle, existence was essentially a single unbroken block. But Ibn Sina, operating in this monotheistic land of prophecy, realized that you have to make a radical distinction between the existence of God and the existence of everything else.
This is perhaps one of the most important conceptual leaps in the history of philosophy. Ibn Sina makes a fundamental, razor-sharp distinction between what a thing is, its essence or quiddity, which in Arabic is mohiyya, and the fact that it actually is its existence or wujud.
Wait, so is this just a fancy way of saying God made everything?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. If you think about a unicorn, you can perfectly define its essence. You know what it is, a horse with a single horn.
Right.
But that essence does not contain existence. Existence has to be added to it from the outside for it to be real.
Okay, so this leads directly to his famous division between the necessary being and contingent beings.
Exactly. Ibn Sina argues that there is only one reality whose very essence is existence. Its non-existence would imply a logical contradiction. This is the necessary being, Wujibawud, which is God. Everything else in the universe, from the stars to the plants to human beings, are contingent beings, Mumkin al-Wud.
So they don't have to exist.
Right. A contingent being is something that, in its own essence, could either exist or not exist. It has a zero balance of existence on its own. It only exists because it receives its existence from a cause outside itself, tracing a chain all the way back to the necessary being.
Okay, I think I've got an analogy for this. Think of the necessary being as the central power grid, and all the contingent beings, you, me, the trees, the stars, as appliances.
Oh, I like that.
A toaster or a television has a specific design, a specific essence. But a toaster doesn't have its own power. It is completely contingent. It only has reality. It only actually does anything when it is plugged into the grid.
Yes, perfectly stated.
The power grid, on the other hand, is power. It doesn't need to be plugged into anything else. So Ibn Sina is basically saying the entire universe is a collection of appliances that are constantly, perpetually receiving their existence from the one source that is existence itself.
That is an excellent way to visualize the mechanics of contingency. And this specific intellectual architecture didn't just stay in the Islamic world. It deeply influenced Jewish thinkers like Maimonides.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely. And it is the exact logical framework Thomas Aquinas used in the 13th century to formulate his proofs for the existence of God for the Christian world. Ibn Sina created a universe that preserves the absolute transcendence of God while explaining how a highly structured hierarchical cosmos emanates from that single source.
But, I want to push back on Ibn Sina's model here, because if we look closely at this power grid, there's a massive theological trapdoor. If God is the necessary being and everything in the universe flows or emanates from his nature necessarily, doesn't that corner Ibn Sina into a deterministic universe?
You're hitting on the exact problem the theologians saw.
Right, because if God acts by necessity of his own nature, where is God's free will? Doesn't this imply that God didn't actively choose to create the world at a specific moment in time, but rather the world just eternally leaks out of him?
You have just articulated the exact logical vulnerability that the Orthodox theologians saw in Ibn Sina's system. The philosophers basically built a universe so bound by logic and necessary emanation that they stripped away the concept of divine choice.
And that didn't go over well.
Not at all. It brings us to one of the most intense intellectual battlegrounds in history. The theology department, the Kalām scholars, looked at Ibn Sina's system and saw a massive threat to God's absolute freedom and omnipotence.
So let's trace how this theological reaction developed.
Yeah.
Early on in Islamic history, you had a theological school called the Mu'tazilites. They were the rationalists of theology. They believed that God was perfectly just, and therefore God must act according to objective justice.
They were very strict about that.
Yeah, they argue that good and evil are objective realities that human reason can discover independently of revelation, and that God couldn't go against that objective good. They fiercely defended human free will, arguing that if humans didn't have free will, it would be unjust for God to punish them in the afterlife.
Right. The Mu'tazilites created a very rational, almost mathematically just theology. But to the more traditional scholars, making God subservient to human concepts of justice or reason was deeply arrogant.
It put limits on God.
Exactly. It limited God's absolute power. If God must do something because it is just, then justice is a higher power than God. This growing reaction found its champion in a man named al-Ash'ari, who actually started out as a prominent Mutazilite.
Wait, really? He switched sides?
He did. At the age of 40, after experiencing a profound dream of the Prophet, al-Ash'ari stood up in the mosque in Basra, dramatically renounced his rationalist views, and founded a new theological school, Asharism.
Wow. And the Ash'arites' primary mission was to make the intellect entirely subservient to God's absolute will. God isn't bound by rules of logic or justice. God makes the rules. Whatever God does is just, simply because God does it.
That is the core of their philosophy.
And here's where it gets really interesting. To protect God's absolute power over every single detail of the universe, they developed a cosmological theory that just completely blew my mind. It is called Asharite atomism, or occasionalism.
It is arguably one of the most radical theories of reality ever devised. The Ash'arites needed a universe where God was not just the original creator who wound up the clock and let it tick, but a God who is actively, directly involved in every single micro-event.
So how do they do that?
To do this, they argued that the universe is not a continuous, solid thing. Instead, space is made of completely disconnected, dimensionless atoms, and time is made of completely disconnected, discontinuous moments.
So they completely destroy the concept of horizontal cause and effect.
Exactly. In our everyday understanding, or in Aristotelian philosophy, physical objects affect other physical objects. If you put a piece of cotton into a fire, the fire burns the cotton because it is in the nature of fire to burn. The fire is the cause, the burning is the effect.
Makes sense to us.
But the Ash'arites say, absolutely not. Fire has no inherent nature. The cotton does not burn because of the fire. The cotton burns because at that exact discontinuous microsecond, God wills the cotton to burn, and he directly creates the blackening and the ash.
Just think about what this means for you, the listener, right now. Think about the chair you're sitting on or the floor beneath your feet. In the Asharite view, that chair does not actually possess the inherent physical strength to hold up your body weight. That is an illusion.
An illusion of habit.
Right. The reality is that the atoms of the chair and the atoms of your body are being completely annihilated and recreated by the direct will of God, millisecond by millisecond, in an arrangement that prevents you from falling to the ground.
It's a universe composed entirely of discrete frames. The illusion of motion and cause and effect only happens because God recreates the frames in a sequential pattern so rapidly.
But I have to challenge this on a practical level. If there is no horizontal cause and effect, if fire doesn't actually cause burning, but God just does it directly every single time, doesn't this completely destroy the foundation of science? Why would anyone ever bother to study nature? How can you have physics or chemistry if nothing actually causes anything else?
That was the precise criticism the philosophers leveled at them. The Ash'arites dissolved all physical laws of nature into one vertical cause, the will of God. They argued that what we perceive as cause and effect is really just a habit of the mind and a habit of God. We are so used to seeing fire and burning happen at the same time that we assume one causes the other, but God could, at any moment, choose to change his habit.
Which perfectly explains miracles for them.
Exactly. A miracle isn't God breaking the laws of physics, because there are no laws of physics to break. A miracle is simply God breaking the habit that he usually maintains. If a prophet walks through a fire without burning, God simply chose not to create the accident of burning in the cotton of his clothes at that specific moment.
That is just wild.
The ultimate goal of this theology was to make the believer feel the immense, crushing, marvelous presence of God's will in every single moment of everyday life.
The universe is literally a matrix. It's a simulation where the code is being actively rewritten at every Planck length of time. And while this theology severely hampered the development of a secular scientific method, because as you said, secular science relies on discovering horizontal causes, it has a bizarre resonance with modern physics.
It really does.
The discontinuous atomized view of time and space, where things jump from state to state without a smooth physical causal link, sounds remarkably like the discontinuous leaps we observe in modern quantum mechanics. The physicist Wolfgang Smith, in his work on the quantum enigma, actually points out that this medieval theological attempt to preserve God's absolute freedom accidentally prefigured the bizarre, non-deterministic reality of the quantum world.
It is a stunning paradox. But back in the medieval world, this Asharite theology gained massive political and social traction. When the brilliant theologian al-Ghazali wrote his famous book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in the late 11th century, systematically tearing down the logical vulnerabilities of Ibn Sina's system, philosophical activity in the Eastern Islamic world was severely curtailed.
They just shut it down.
The philosophers were really put on the defensive. However, the intellectual energy didn't simply vanish, it migrated. The torch was carried to the far west of the Islamic Empire, to the Maghrib and Islamic Spain, known as Andalusia.
Right. While the East was dominated by empires that heavily supported Ash'arite theology to centralize their orthodox power, the West blossomed with this distinct, fiercely independent philosophical flavor. In Andalusia, you have early figures like Ibn Masara, who blended philosophy with mysticism. You have Ibn Hazm, a brilliant jurist who wrote The Ring of the Dove.
Oh, that's a beautiful text.
Yeah, which is an incredibly beautiful analytical treatise on the nature of Platonic love. And you have Ibn Bajjah, who developed the concept of the solitary intellectual. The idea that if society is corrupt, the philosopher must spiritually and intellectually detach from the masses to unite their mind with the active intellect.
Ibn Bajjah sets the tone for Andalusian philosophy. It is deeply concerned with the individual's capacity to reach ultimate truth independently. And this theme reaches its absolute zenith in the work of a 12th century physician, scientist, and political figure named Ibn Tufayl.
Ibn Tufayl is the author of what has to be one of the greatest thought experiments in human history. He wrote a philosophical novel called Hay Idem Yaksan, which translates to Living Son of the Awake.
It's a masterpiece.
The premise is mesmerizing. A baby boy is spontaneously generated on an uninhabited, completely deserted island. He has no parents, no society, no language, no books, and no religion. He is adopted and nursed by a gazelle.
It is the ultimate isolation of the human intellect. Ibn Tufayl is setting up a controlled laboratory environment. He wants to know, what is the pure human mind capable of discovering without any outside help?
And things get intense pretty fast.
Yes. As Hay grows up, his gazelle mother dies. He is devastated, but he is also intellectually driven to understand what happened. He dissects her body.
So let's walk through this deduction because it's brilliant. How does a feral child invent physics and theology?
Through rigorous empirical observation. When Hay dissects the gazelle, he observes that all her physical organs are perfectly intact, yet she is no longer moving or living. He deduces that whatever made her alive, the vital spirit, was something that occupied the physical form but was not the form itself.
He realizes the ghost left the machine.
Exactly. He realizes this vital spirit has departed. This triggers a lifelong journey. He begins to observe the plants and the animals, realizing they all share a life force. He moves from biology to physics, observing the properties of heat and cold, heaviness and lightness. He looks up at the stars and tracks their movements, deducing the laws of celestial mechanics.
He basically realizes that the universe isn't just a random collection of objects, but a unified, incredibly complex machine.
Exactly. And once he grasps the immense, flawless complexity of this machine, his pure logic dictates that such a contingent structure cannot exist without a necessary cause. Through strict, unguided, rational deduction, moving step by step from the physical anatomy of a gazelle to the movement of the heavens, Hay logically deduces the necessary existence of an immaterial, perfect creator God.
He figures out the entire metaphysical structure of the universe just by thinking about it. And then the plot thickens. A man named Absol arrives on the island from a neighboring civilization. Absol has been raised with revealed religion. He has scriptures, prophets, and religious laws.
Right, he brings society with him.
When Absol teaches Hay language, they start comparing notes, and they realize something mind-blowing. Hay's purely rational discoveries perfectly, exactly match the revealed truths of Absol's religion.
Ibn Tufayl is arguing a profound point here. Pure, uncorrupted human reason and divine revelation are simply two paths leading to the exact same truth. There is no inherent conflict. The truth discovered by the philosopher in isolation is identical to the truth delivered by the prophet to the masses.
That must have been a controversial idea.
It was revolutionary. This book was so revolutionary that it was translated into Latin in the 17th century, titled Philosophus Autodidactus, and heavily influenced the European Enlightenment, even inspiring Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe.
And Ibn Tufayl's younger contemporary and friend was the man who would take this argument to its absolute limit, becoming the most famous Islamic philosopher in the West. Ibn Rushd, known to Europe as Averroes, he was the ultimate, uncompromising Aristotelian.
Ibn Rushd saw the damage that al-Ghazali's attack had done to philosophy in the East, and he set out to systematically defend the philosophical enterprise. He wrote a massive point-by-point rebuttal to al-Ghazali called The Incoherence of the Incoherence.
I love that title.
It's very direct. His primary goal was to definitively harmonize religion and philosophy, to prove legally and intellectually that the pursuit of philosophy was not heresy, but a religious obligation for those capable of it.
What really fascinates me about Ibn Rushd's defense is his specific use of a tool called Tawil esoteric hermeneutics, or allegorical interpretation. He's essentially arguing that the literalists, the orthodox theologians who attack philosophy, are actually the ones disrespecting the Quran by ignoring the deeper philosophical reality it points to.
That is a highly astute reading of his project. Ibn Rushd argued that the truth of revelation is absolute and indisputable. However, human beings are not identical in their intellectual capacities.
Right, we don't all think the same way.
Exactly. The vast majority of people require symbols, parables, and stark imagery like physical descriptions of heaven and hell, or God sitting on a throne, to understand moral truths and be guided to live a good life. The Quran uses this rhetorical language to speak to the masses.
But for the intellectual elite.
For the intellectual elite, the philosophers who have spent decades training their minds in rigorous logic, God intended for them to look past the literal words. When a philosopher encounters a verse in the Quran that seems to contradict demonstrative logic, Ibn Rushd argues that they are required to use tawil.
They have to dig deeper.
They must interpret the text allegorically to discover the deeper philosophical truth behind those symbols. The theologians panicked at this because they felt it allowed philosophers to rewrite religion. But Ibn Rushd wasn't saying philosophy overguns religion. He was saying philosophy is the deepest, most sophisticated way to understand the inner reality of religion.
Yet, despite his brilliance, the West completely misunderstood him. When European scholars translated his works into Latin, they basically stripped away his Islamic theological context.
Profoundly misunderstood. European scholars, particularly in Paris, read him as proposing a double truth theory, the dangerous idea that something could be logically true in philosophy but completely false in theology, and that you could hold both contradictory views simultaneously.
Which is exactly what he wasn't saying.
Exactly. They used this distorted version of Averroes as a wedge to violently separate reason from faith, which ultimately paved the way for the secularization of the cosmos in the West. But Ibn Rushd himself was a deeply pious Muslim, a religious judge in Cordoba. He never believed in a double truth. Truth is one, just accessed through different methods.
It is a tragic historical irony that the man who tried so hard to unite faith and reason was used as the exact instrument to divorce them in Europe. And sadly, after Ibn Rushd's death in 1198, this specific brand of rigorous Aristotelian rationalism essentially died out in the Islamic West.
That's right.
The bridge narrative says this is where the story ends. But as we established at the beginning, the bridge didn't collapse. Philosophy didn't die. It rebounded back to the East, into Persia and beyond, and it mutated into something profoundly mystical, beautiful, and entirely unique, driven by the failures of pure logic to satisfy the human soul.
The center of gravity shifts dramatically in the late 12th century with the arrival of a young, staggering genius named Shihab al-Din Suhrawardī. Born in 1153 in western Persia, Suhrawardī looked at the massive logical edifice built by Ibn Sina and realized it was incomplete.
Just logic wasn't enough for him.
Right. He argued that discursive, purely logical philosophy was absolutely necessary as a foundational training, but it was only the first step. If you stop at logic, you only have theoretical knowledge of reality. To attain true wisdom, you have to move beyond rational analysis into direct intellectual intuition. You must experience illumination. He founded what became known as the School of Illumination, or Ishraq.
Suhrawardī was brilliant, but he was also dangerous. He didn't live long enough to see his influence spread. He was executed in Aleppo when he was only 38 years old because the local jurists found his ideas far too controversial, too closely echoing ancient Persian ideas.
A tragic loss.
But his followers went underground, and his philosophy survived. He didn't just tweak Avicenna's ontology. He integrated Platonism, the angelology of ancient Zoroastrianism, and Avicennan logic into a massive, breathtaking metaphysics of light.
The cosmology of Ishraq completely reimagines the substance of reality. Suhrawardī rejected the Aristotelian idea that the universe is made of dead matter and form. He argued that the fundamental exclusive building block of all reality is light. Everything that exists is simply a varying degree or intensity of light emanating from the supreme source, which he called the light of lights, Nur al-Anwar, which is God.
So, okay, instead of a power grid and appliances, how should we visualize this universe of light?
Think of existence not as distinct physical objects, but as a universal hologram, or a complex array of prisms. From the light of lights emanates a massive hierarchy of lesser lights. There are longitudinal arrays of lights that form the archangels and the levels of existence. And there are latitudinal arrays of lights that act as the Platonic archetypes, the glowing blueprints for everything in our physical world.
Wow, okay.
What we perceive as solid, dense, dead matter is actually just the absence of light, or a shadow cast when a lesser light is obscured. In the system, the universe is vibrantly alive, glowing with angelic consciousness.
So what does this all mean for us? Because the most radical part of Suhrawardī's philosophy isn't just the cosmology, it's his epistemology. It's how we actually learn about this universe of light. He posited that there is an eternal Doa Sophia perennis, or perennial wisdom, hidden within the very substance of humanity. But to unlock it, cerebral knowledge is completely insufficient.
Suhrawardī insisted on an absolute organic nexus between intellectual activity and severe inner purification. You need rigorous logical training to discipline the mind so you don't fall into delusion, but you equally need intense ascetic practice to subdue the carnal soul.
You can't just be a bookworm.
Exactly. Only when the heart is thoroughly purified, like a polished mirror, can it actually receive the illumination, the ishraq from the angelic lights.
This essentially makes philosophy a full-body spiritual contact sport. It wasn't enough to be a library intellectual who could win debates on syllogisms. You had to actively work on becoming a saint. If Aristotelian logic is like studying the complex mathematical theory of optics and refraction, Suhrawardī is saying that true philosophy is opening your eyes and stepping out into the blinding sun to actually experience the warmth and color of the light. You have to experience the reality, not just categorize it.
That is a perfect encapsulation. And this leads to Suhrawardī's deeply poetic concept of the Occidental exile.
Oh, I wanted to get to this.
In the geographic symbolism of Ishraq, the Orient, the East, is not a physical place on a map. It is the origin of light, the spiritual realm of the angels. The Occident, the West, is the dark, dense, material world. Suhrawardī says that human beings are spiritual creatures of light who have fallen into the material world.
We're trapped here.
Yes, we are trapped in a well of darkness in the Occidental exile. The entire purpose of illuminative philosophy is to help the soul remember its original home, orient itself, and journey back to the Orient of light.
It is an incredibly beautiful, integrated vision of human purpose. And this wedding of strict logic and spiritual intuition perfectly sets up our next figure. We're going to look at one of the most famous, yet most misunderstood figures in world history. A man who is famous in the West for all the wrong reasons. Omar Khayyam.
Omar Khayyam is perhaps the ultimate case study in how history, translation, and cultural projection can completely distort a legacy. In the West, largely due to Edward Fitzgerald's wildly popular 19th century translation of his Rubaiyat, Khayyam is viewed through a Victorian lens.
Right, the stereotypical image.
The popular image is of a nihilistic hedonist, a skeptical rebel sitting in a tavern drinking wine, lamenting the meaninglessness of life and mocking religious faith.
The ultimate frat party YOLO manifesto, basically. Drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But the historical texts we are examining systematically dismantle this myth. Khayyam wasn't a rebel hanging out in taverns. He was a deeply revered, highly orthodox Islamic scholar. His contemporaries literally call him the philosopher of the world and the proof of truth.
Which is a far cry from a tavern drunk.
Exactly. On his deathbed, he wasn't singing drinking songs. He was actively teaching the complex metaphysics section of Ibn Sina's Book of Healing, reading the chapter on the unity of God before drawing his last breath.
The historical reality of Khayyam is that he was a brilliant, rigorous, multifaceted thinker. He was an Abyssinian philosopher who wrote dense treatises on the nature of being, defending the utter goodness of God and tackling theodicy, explaining why evil exists in a world created by a good God. He argued that evil is simply a privation of being, not a positive reality.
And he was a math genius too, right?
Furthermore, he was a genius mathematician. He wrote one of the most important medieval treatises on algebra, classifying cubic equations, and he did groundbreaking work criticizing Euclid's parallel postulate. He was a man obsessed with cosmic mathematical order, an order which he explicitly argued was evidence of the divine origin.
So, okay, how do we square the brilliant, pious mathematician with the poetry about wine and the meaninglessness of it all? The key is that you have to analyze his poetry through his actual philosophical and Sufi lens. In the universal language of Sufi poetry, wine is an alcohol. Wine symbolizes realized gnosis, the intoxicating, overwhelming experience of direct divine knowledge that Suhrawardī was talking about.
And when Khayyam writes so frequently about focusing entirely on the present moment, he is not advocating for hedonistic escapism or ignoring the future. He is referencing the core Sufi concept of being the son of the moment, Ibn al-Waqt.
Living in the now, but spiritually.
Yes. In Sufism, the past is gone and therefore lacks reality, and the future is a conceptual illusion. The only place you can actually access the eternal, the only place you can experience the presence of God, is in the immediate, razor-sharp point of the absolute present.
Let's unpack one specific poem because it really highlights how a philosophical reading changes everything. There's a poem where he talks about a fly appearing, buzzing around for a second and then disappearing. The Victorian secular reading says, look, Khayyam thinks human life is as meaningless and annoying as a fly. We are born, we die, it means nothing, so just drink.
But the philosophical reading completely inverts that. We have to look at the specific Persian words Khayyam used in that poem. Padid, which means manifest, and napaida, which means unmanifest or invisible.
Ah, so it's technical terminology.
Exactly. He is not talking about meaningless biological life and death. He is talking about ontology. He is dramatizing the Avicennan concept of contingency we discussed earlier. The fly, representing the human soul, comes from the unmanifested, invisible world of the divine, flashes briefly into the manifested phenomenal world of material existence to receive its existence, and then returns to the unmanifested reality of its source. It is a profound metaphysical statement on how all things emanate from and return to God, not a statement of nihilism.
I have to admit, I struggle a bit with how a mind like his operates. How does a rigorous mathematician, a guy who writes treatises on algebra and the parallel postulate, deal comfortably with such poetic vagueness and mystical symbolism? Doesn't the math side of his brain rebel against the poetry?
Not if you understand how Khayyam categorized human knowledge. Khayyam actually wrote a fascinating treatise where he explicitly categorized the different types of truth seekers. He lists the theologians who rely on debate. He lists the philosophers who rely only on rational syllogistic arguments. And he lists the Ismailis who rely on the authority of an instructor.
So who wins?
He ranks the Sufis at the very top. He explicitly states that the Sufis, who purify their inner being to reflect spiritual truths without the veil of worldly impurity, possess the highest, most perfect form of knowledge. For Khayyam, mathematics and logic were vital, precise tools for understanding the material and conceptual world, but poetry and mystical intuition were the only languages expansive enough to express the ultimate transcendent truths of the divine.
That makes perfect sense. Logic for the structure, poetry for the ultimate reality. Khayyam stood as this lonely, brilliant bridge during a time when theology was really dominating philosophy in the East, but he paved the way for what was coming next. Because post-Khayyam, a massive geopolitical trauma shifted the intellectual landscape again. The devastating Mongol invasion swept through the Islamic world in the 13th century, destroying Baghdad and countless centers of learning. Yet out of that destruction, the center of philosophical gravity shifted again, triggering a massive Eastern Renaissance.
The philosophical tradition proved incredibly resilient. Following the Mongol devastation, the focus shifted first to the region of Azerbaijan, specifically around the city of Maraga.
And this is where we meet Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Tusi is a survivor and a monumental intellect. He managed to survive the Mongol invasions by entering the service of the Mongol conqueror Hulagu Khan. He somehow convinced the man who destroyed Baghdad to fund and build the massive Maraga Observatory, gathering scientists from across the world.
Tusi is one of those historical figures whose sheer output defies belief. While directing this massive observatory and producing groundbreaking astronomical tables that would later influence Copernicus, he also single-handedly resuscitated Ibn Sina's philosophy.
He brought Avicenna back.
He really did. He wrote a brilliant, point-by-point, devastatingly logical rebuttal to the theologians who had attacked Avicenna. But Tusi's intellectual flexibility is what makes him so important. He was a master peripatetic philosopher, yet he also penned highly esoteric works on Ismaili philosophy. And incredibly, he wrote the Catharsis of Doctrines, which used Avicennan logic to establish the definitive foundational text for Shiite systematic theology.
He is writing the definitive textbook for logic, the definitive textbook for theology, and running a world-class observatory all at the same time. But as amazing as Azerbaijan was, the true melting pot of this Renaissance, where all these complex threads finally weave together, was further south. The philosophical capital shifted to the city of Shiraz, which enjoyed relative peace during the chaotic post-Mongol centuries. From the 14th to the 16th centuries, the School of Shiraz became the ultimate intellectual laboratory.
The School of Shiraz is where the grand synthesis truly takes form. You have remarkable families of scholars, like the Dashtaki family, specifically Sadr al-Din and his son Giyeth al-Din. You also have Jalal al-Din Dawani, famous for his work on philosophical ethics. What makes Shiraz so vital is that they weren't just practicing one isolated type of philosophy.
They mixed everything together.
Exactly. The scholars in Shiraz were actively debating and harmonizing peripatetic logic, Suhrawardī's Illuminationist light mysticism, Sufi gnosis, and scholastic theology.
Wait, how exactly did they do that? Because Avicenna's logic and Suhrawardī's light mysticism seem fundamentally opposed in their methods, right?
They did it by recognizing that different methods apply to different levels of reality. They would use Avicennan logic to structure the arguments and debate the physical world, but they would use Suhrawardī's metaphysics of light to explain the ultimate nature of being and the soul's ascent.
Ah, so they combined the tools.
They were proving that rational deduction and mystical intuition were not enemies, but two halves of a whole. They argued fiercely amongst themselves. Sadr al-Din Dashtaki and Dawani had a famous decades-long debate over the exact nature of existence and quiddity, but they were arguing within a shared, highly sophisticated framework.
I just marvel at the interdisciplinarity of it all. These guys weren't just philosophers locked in an ivory tower arguing over semantics. Giyeth al-Din Dashtaki, for example, was called the 11th intellect. He was an authority in everything from pharmacology and medicine to astronomy, architecture, and Quranic commentary. They were chief judges and engineers. I compare the School of Shiraz to a Renaissance Florence of the East, but frankly, it was far more integrated. The boundaries between math, poetry, theology, and logic were completely porous.
And if we step back and look at the broader impact, the vibrant, deeply integrated synthesis achieved in Shiraz laid the exact groundwork for the next monumental shift in Islamic philosophy. That would be Mullah Sadra and the School of Isfahan in the 17th century, which created the transcendent theosophy.
So it kept going and evolving.
Furthermore, the School of Shiraz massively exported these intellectual frameworks. The philosophical texts and the integrated curriculum developed in Shiraz, such as the Darz-e-Nizami, were exported to Mughal India, becoming the absolute foundation of Islamic education in the Indian subcontinent for centuries.
It's just an overwhelming intellectual legacy. So let's recap this incredible journey for everyone listening. We started by smashing the myth of the temporary bridge, revealing a 1,200-year continuous tradition. We explored the rigorous power grid ontology of Avicenna that structured medieval thought. We looked at the mind-bending, matrix-like atomism of the Asharite theologians who wanted to protect God's absolute freedom.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We watched Ibn Tufayil's feral philosopher figure out the mechanics of the universe on a deserted island. We bathed in the glowing, angelic light worlds of Suhrawardī's Illuminationism. We rescued Omar Khayyam from the Victorian drinking clubs, restoring him as a master metaphysician of the present moment. And finally, we saw all these profound threads weave together into a master synthesis in the brilliant Renaissance melting pot of Shiraz.
It is a profound testament to the human intellect striving relentlessly to understand reality, all while remaining within the embrace of the sacred. But, exploring this history leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Oh, I'm ready. What is it?
In our modern era, we have strictly and violently divided the sciences from the humanities. We have severed logic from spirituality. We look at the cosmos purely as a dead machine, a secularized view that, ironically, a distorted translation of Ibn Rushd helped teach the West to adopt. But this vast tradition of Islamic philosophy argues something fundamentally different. It argues that true, ultimate wisdom is structurally impossible if you divide the intellect from the heart.
Right. Because if we only view the universe as dead matter and physical laws, we lose the orient of light that Suhrawardī talked about. We lose the ultimate meaning behind the mechanics.
Exactly. Consider how our modern pursuit of knowledge might fundamentally change if we demanded, like Suhrawardī and the sages of Shiraz, that our scientists, our technologists, and our philosophers must also undergo rigorous spiritual purification. What if understanding reality wasn't just about collecting raw data, but about actively transforming one's own character to become a polished mirror capable of reflecting the truth? It challenges the very foundation of how we define knowing today.
That is a thought that is going to stick with me for a long time. The X-ray machine of modern knowledge might give us a very sharp picture of the bones, but if the mirror of the heart isn't polished, maybe we are completely blind to the light. Thank you so much for sharing these incredible sources with us and for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the big questions, keep exploring the architecture of reality, and we'll see you next time.